I'm going to talk about the external situation, if you like, to frame what's going on internally, which Meredith will talk about. I visited Rojava nearly 2 years ago as part of the making of this film, which explores alternative forms of society, alternative political and economic models. And what is going on in Rojava is the most articulated form of a bottom-up self-governing society that we have in the world today, with a very strong emphasis on the role of women, the leadership of women. And personally, I feel it's an extraordinarily important example for us to consider, but also to support, hence the existence of the North America Rojava Alliance, which is trying to create that solidarity here in the United States. The situation of Rojava today, geopolitically, if you like, is very much a function of the Syrian war. The Rojava project of self-rule in the Kurdish-dominated areas of northeast Syria came about because of the Syrian revolution and the collapse of the Syrian regime's authority across Syria. When that happened in northeast Syria, the PYD, which is the main Kurdish party, asserted self-government across the region. At the same time, its forces, the YPG and the YPJ, which is the female militia, one the male, one the female, began to fight against the extremists of ISIS. It's important to note that Rojava and the PYD/YPG is not at war with the Syrian regime. This is one of the many, many complications of the situation of Rojava. They're in a kind of de facto truce. The PYD does not, however, support the dictatorship of the Assad regime and wants to see a federalized or confederal system for Syria, building on the Rojava model of bottom-up, non-sectarian, inclusive self-government, a model that they feel is plausible, and I feel is plausible for the whole of Syria, and indeed for the Middle East and indeed the entire world. But it is a complication of their situation because the PYD and the Kurds do not align with the main democratic Syrian opposition, the Syria Coalition, the HNC, the Higher Negotiating Committee, which is supported by the West as the main political democratic alternative to the Syrian regime. So Western support for the PYD and YPG is very much a function of the battle against ISIS, where on the ground approximately 50,000 YPG and YPJ forces have been fighting ISIS for several years across a front of several hundred miles, which has slowly advanced across northeast Syria. Until now, the front lines are, thank you, Debbie, the front lines are very close to the city of Raqqa, which of course is ISIS's headquarters city. And Raqqa is more or less surrounded now by the SDF. Now, in this alphabet soup of acronyms, the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, is a joint Kurdish Arab force comprised of the YPG, YPJ, and various local Arab groups. But it is predominantly a Kurdish-dominated force. The YPG and the YPJ, as Debbie has said, has been highly successful in pushing back ISIS across Syria. It is the only group that has successfully taken territory from ISIS, and without them, there is no possibility that Raqqa will fall. That is the reason that the US gives military, and it's important to distinguish military from political support. The US gives military support to the YPG and YPJ. During the Obama administration, this military support was limited to basically coordination over airstrikes. And when I was there, I saw this coordination happen. The YPG leaders had technology that connected them to US Air Force forward air controllers to identify ISIS targets, which would then be bombed by US Air Force and coalition aircraft. But the YPG at that time complained to me very loudly that they needed much more significant heavy weapons to fight ISIS on the ground, including the sort of weapons that are furnished to the KRG Peshmerga forces in northern Iraq, such as surface-to-surface missiles, armored vehicles, this kind of thing. And only recently, under the Trump administration, has the US started to deliver those kind of weapons to the YPG and YPJ, which in turn has caused very significant controversy with Turkey, which is the other enormously complicating factor for Rojava and the democratic experiment in Rojava, because Turkey claims that the PYD stroke YPG, and I'm even there using a shortening of the full description of that group, is effectively a part of the PKK, which Turkey has of course been fighting for decades in southeast Turkey, and that therefore Turkey is very hostile to the YPG, YPJ, and extremely hostile to their taking of territory across the southern border of Turkey, the northern border of Syria, and is extremely angry with the United States that it is now significantly arming the YPG and YPJ. And I should add that the US has also deployed significant numbers of troops on the ground. Nobody really talks about this, but there are large numbers of special forces troops. There's now even regular marine units on the ground. One of the extraordinary things about the modern world is you can now see periscope footage of US special forces moving around the front lines with ISIS on Kurdish Twitter streams. The US has also opened at least one and possibly two rough airfields in Kurdish-controlled territory to deliver these weapons directly to the SDF forces. Anyway, we're in an extraordinary moment in all of this because Raqqa is now surrounded, and the defeat of ISIS in Syria is now in sight. They will be defeated in due course. How long that will take, nobody knows. The battle for Mosul over the border in Iraq indicates that any battle for Raqqa is likely to be a long and very difficult one. But nonetheless, minds are already turning to what will happen after the defeat of Raqqa and the territorial defeat, at least, of ISIS, because, of course, as we all know, that even if you take ISIS territory, it doesn't mean the end of ISIS. ISIS will fragment into a insurgent group, and indeed ISIS has continued to attack YPG and PYD institutions inside Rojava long after that territory has been conquered, by maintaining so-called suicide cells of small groups of ISIS fighters who will pop up many months after the territory has been retaken to commit horrific suicide attacks, again, which are barely reported here in the United States or indeed the West as a whole, because one of the severe problems that Rojava faces is that it's extremely difficult to get to. It is cut off from the north, from the Turkish side, and from the southern side by the Kurdistan Regional Government, the KRG, which is the US and Turkish-backed Kurdish government of northern Iraq, led by Masoud Barzani, who is in turn, because of his relationship with Turkey, to collaborate against the PKK, whose main military bases are in northern Turkey, is of course hostile to the PYD and the YPG. And one of the complicating factors is that Barzani has promoted a particular Kurdish party as a kind of proxy called the KNC, the Kurdish National Council, which claims to in fact represent the people of Rojava, and has been incorporated into the overall umbrella of the Syrian opposition, which Turkey supports and is happy for the KNC to be part of, because the KNC and the KRG are in fact their allies. So this is an extraordinarily complicated picture, and I genuinely wonder how many external players, and even us to a degree, fully understand what is going on. But I think in simple terms, what we're looking at is that there is now a very open question as to the future of Rojava post the fall of Raqqa. As long as the fight against ISIS continues at this scale and intensity, it seems likely that the US will continue its support of Rojava and the KRG, and the YPG, YPJ, I get mixed up. But that is only military support. They have refused to offer any political relationship with the PYD, despite the multiple outreaches from the PYD towards the US authorities, both through the form of the US Special Envoy, a chap called Brett McGurk, but also directly to US embassies. The PYD would like to have a relationship with the United States, but the United States refuses to have such a relationship because that would be a step too far in its own highly delicate relationship with Turkey. Turkey would be ferociously resistant to any US relationship. So there is a real question as to what will be the future Western Rojava relationship after the defeat of ISIS. And there is a real possibility, and US officials have tacitly admitted this, that come that moment, the US will essentially throw Rojava and the YPG under the bus and abandon them to their fate with Turkey, and Turkey will take that as a green light to attack Rojava and the PYD-YPG inside Syria. Turkey has already mounted air attacks and some ground attacks on YPG positions in northern Syria. There is basically the fulcrum of the conflict as a whole in Syria is an area of the middle of Syria, north of Raqqa, where the territory is disputed. And what the Kurds would like to do is create a contiguous zone of control all along the southern Turkish border to join the two main Kurdish areas, one in the west, Afrin Canton, and the other in the east, which is Rojava. And this, of course, is something that is totally anathema to Turkey because it would mean Kurdish control across its southern border, controlled by a party that it regards as totally hostile to the Turkish state. Anyway, so I think in summary, a highly fragile political situation for Rojava, where the PYD is trying to embed these institutions of self-government and habits of self-government in the local population in a way to make Rojava politically resilient for the long term. At the same time, militarily, the YPG and the YPJ has grown in strength, has now grown in its military capability thanks to US support. And even if the US were to abandon them, would be a formidable opponent for anybody who tried to take them on, whether Turkey or the Syrian regime. And I think if there is any future settlement in Syria, which is now, I'm afraid, looking more plausible than once it might have, because we've entered a kind of period of stasis in the Syrian civil war, and growing US-Russian, at least conversation about what the future of Syria should be, and growing collaboration between Turkey, Iran, and Russia over what the future of Syria should be, exemplified by the recent Astana talks. The future dispensation of Syria is at issue, and of course what Rojava would like is to be allowed to govern itself autonomously, and as I said, indeed for its model to be adopted more widely in Syria. Unfortunately, I think that's unlikely. Outside parties and indeed the democratic opposition itself tend to think of centralized government from Damascus that is, putatively multi-ethnic, but will suffer from all the problems of centralized governments in the Middle East, of being the main repository and disperser of funds, thus a source of great corruption, and favoritism between certain ethnic groups. But unfortunately, that seems to be the only model of government that officials in the West and indeed in places like Russia seem to be able to conceive. And one of our jobs is, I think, to promote the model of Rojava for Syria and indeed for the world. One thing the PYD will say vehemently is they do not want the breakup of Syria. They do not want to form a Kurdish state. The situation of the Kurds in Turkey, in Syria, and in northern Iraq, and in Iran are each different in significant ways. And the project of Kurdish unity is arguably as far away as it has been for a long time. but above all complicated by the interests of external powers, each of which uses these parties as pawns in the sort of post-colonial chess game for the future of Syria and Iraq. I'm sure I've confused everybody totally. Forgive me. And with that, I'll turn over to Meredith to describe what's going on inside Rojava.
Thank you. So the reason I wrote this book, which is called A Road Unforeseen from Tolkien, is because I couldn't understand any of the stuff Karen was talking about, and I got obsessed with it during the Battle of Kobani and could not tear myself away from Twitter and Facebook and everything, trying to figure out what was going on, particularly as I kept seeing these faces of women soldiers, people I hadn't seen in some years, although they were quite evident during the 60s in many battles. And I wanted to understand what was going on. And so I wrote this book, which talks about not only Rojava, but also about the Iraqi Kurds, what has happened to Kurds in Turkey over the long years of incredible persecution, which was also true in Iraq, and also about ISIS, because I think that this little place is a focus of the three main contenders for what will happen in the 21st century, one of which is this sort of this hideous theocracy based on violence, one of which is a sort of, capitalist modernity is the phrase they use in Rojava, which is complicated by corruption and tribalism in the case of Iraqi Kurdistan. And then the third is this as yet largely untested model of bottoms-up democracy, very strong militias, and very strong women's participation, complicated by various other things, including the heritage of a Marxist-Leninist party. So this is all very complicated, but it's really important because these are the same models that are being enacted in various other parts of the world. Just to touch on some of the things Karen said and recap, some of the important things about Rojava in brief are, it's based on bottoms-up participatory democracy, voting in neighborhood units, then on to larger units in a city, and finally up to this larger unit that's the three cantons. They don't say they're a state. They specifically say they don't want to have a state. They're not interested in being a state. They think the state is an oppressive mechanism that it leads nowhere good. So they have something else that they call democratic autonomy or democratic confederalism. This is also true economically. They're trying to do as much based on cooperatives as possible. And in all the structures of self-administration, which is what we call government, there are parallel women's structures. So if you have a neighborhood commune, you have a women's commune equivalent that interfaces with it. And the same on every level, the same on the level of the armed struggle. They're very committed to environmentalism, and they're at war with everybody around them and under a blockade from both Turkey and Iraqi Kurdistan. And so that even though they've taken in hundreds of thousands of refugees, they can't get any aid, they can't get food for them, the UN doesn't send anything in, they're supporting everything themselves and they barely have enough food. So that's the situation in a nutshell. But the thing that has interested me particularly was to find out how women became so prominent in this revolution, because it's not normal. And especially it's not normal in a history that started with a conventional Marxist-Leninist People's War formation in Turkey, because it's a real departure from Marxist tradition in which women's suppression is given some recognition but never put in the center of the political struggle. It always tends to be deferred until later in the interest of something more important. And women are seen as an adjunct or a part of the main struggle, whose work is useful only so far as it serves the main struggle and or largely for that reason. And you know, this is, and ideologically, this has been true, you know, from the beginning. Organizationally, it's also been true that any autonomous women's formations have been discouraged because everything has been seen in terms of a centralized party or state. And you know, we can go through. There have been, you know, momentary departures from this tradition in various countries. In the early 70s, I was much struck by Jack Belden's book, China Shakes the World, in which he talks about a woman called Goldflower who reacted against domestic violence and got all the women in her village on her side, and they beat up her oppressive family. And that seemed very wonderful at the time, but they didn't keep doing that. They pulled back from that policy. And so even though China and many other countries had good results in mobilizing women for the revolution as a whole, it was never on a feminist basis. There are chairs up here, lots. Even today, the Central Committee is overwhelmingly male, and new feminist efforts are repressed. And it's been the same with, you know, this is a gross generalization, and there are many, many, you know, exceptions. In the general history of the national liberation struggles of my youth, women were often part of the armed struggle in a similar way to what we see in Rojava, but were demobilized after it, or were limited to support functions within it, not actual combat. And after the revolution, they would be lucky if they got social work ministries. They certainly never were put in charge of defense or the economy or anything where you could make money or have any power. So what made the Kurdish liberation movement so different? It's different in ideology, because women are put at the center of the revolution, replacing the working class, in fact, as the leading agent of revolution. This is in the doctrine. It's different organizationally, because there are dual structures at every level except the very, very top of the PKK. There are co-leaders at every organization, one woman, one man. There are quotas in every organization. Every business, every farm, every commune has a minimum 40% women. There are seats up at the front. And it's different from other revolutions in program in that women's participation in the armed struggle is framed not only in terms of fighting the enemy, ISIS, or sometimes Turkey, but in terms of self-defense. That women need to learn how to defend themselves, they need to learn how to defend their people, that this is a struggle against ISIS, which is incredibly violent and horrible to women, and it's a struggle of all women. And women need to learn how to fight it as well as men in order to get respect and in order to learn how to give leadership. So self-defense is central to the formation, the framing of this revolution and this kind of feminism. Also central to the program is a program for violence against women in a much more developed way than I've seen elsewhere, in that there are special committees set up in every area to take care of violence against women. There are various kinds of solutions to it, and ideologically it's very central, combating this kind of violence. Or as Öcalan, who is their ideological leader, puts it, killing the dominant male. And also education on women's rights is central at every level. I mean, everything has an educational program. And the history, as they see it, of women's struggle in the Middle East and the need for women's autonomy and self-organization and self-defense is a very central part of the educational program. So how did this happen? This is not a normal trajectory for any revolution we've seen before. And I think it happened in the 90s. I mean, the PKK itself was founded in Turkey in 1978. But for many years, it was your sort of standard guerrilla organization in the mountains. There were women fighting in it from the beginning, but they weren't particularly noticeable, except for a few individuals. But in the 90s, several factors converged. The military struggle wasn't working. And so some of the leadership, particularly Öcalan, began to want to change the strategy from the purely guerrilla strategy of fighting in the mountains to one that was more flexible and took account of the fact that many, because of the long war against the Kurds, many Kurds had moved to cities and were in a different position sociologically than they had been before. And that perhaps it was possible to have negotiations for a more democratic state. So all of this was a big struggle within the party. That's the first factor. The second factor is, as Kurds moved into the cities, civil resistance began to develop in the cities, along with a parliamentary party for the first time. And that party has had many incarnations, but they happened at the same time, and they were both led very prominently by women. And the third thing is that there were struggles by women within the party for more autonomy and more respect. And particularly, there's chairs up at the front if you want, lots over here. Given leadership by a woman named Sakin Kansas, who was later assassinated in Paris, who had been a hero because she had been in prison and had fought very strongly in prison. And this also was in 1995, a lot of this happened. And don't forget, the 2 years leading up to that were one of global mobilization by women, which ended up in the Beijing conference and several other UN conferences. And there were Kurds there. And they brought back some of that as a sort of internationalist encouragement. So that's just a brief summary. I mean, I can go into more details if you want, but basically the interesting stuff starts in the 90s when this civil resistance movement, which is called the Sirhildan, begins, a movement for Kurdish civil rights, because Kurds were enormously oppressed within Turkey. They were not even allowed to use Kurdish as a language. They were basically shut out of the educational system in large part. They had no civil rights. I mean, you could be arrested for talking Kurdish to your mother in the street. There were no Kurdish organizations, and all that gradually changed as a result of civil mobilization. There are chairs up here. And the struggle within the PKK and the influence of the Beijing Congress. And then in 1999, what happened is Öcalan, who has been the ideological leader of this movement since it began, got caught by Turkey with the help of the CIA. He was kicked out. He had been living in Damascus for many, many years. They finally came under so much pressure from Turkey, they kicked him out. And then he migrated to various other countries and was finally captured in Kenya and put on a plane to Turkey and put in a big show trial. And interestingly enough, this did not destroy the organization at all. In some ways, it strengthened it because he began to write in jail, whereas he hadn't done very much of that before. And his documents were much more systematic than things that had come out before, and including about women. And the party also split two different ways. One, this is really complicated, I don't even think I need to go into this, but one basically left and one right. One toward in the direction of the KDP in Iraq, and the other in the direction of continuing the armed struggle and nothing else. And meanwhile, Öcalan was elaborating a theory of democratic confederalism and bottoms-up democracy within these other states that he got partly from Debbie's father, Murray Bookchin, and other places as well. And in 2005, he wrote a Declaration of Democratic Confederalism, which unleashed a great democratic movement among Kurds in Turkey, lots of local community organizing, and led to a huge conference in 2007, which adopted bottom-up democratic principles and brought together all the different elements of this Kurdish movement, the civil resistance, the parliamentarians, teachers, local activists, social workers, as well as the PKK. Now, in all this time, I've been talking about Turkey, and that's because the main action was in Turkey until the Syrian revolution in 2012. There was a small There was lots of action in Iraq, but it wasn't in this organizational frame at all. It was very different. And Syria, there wasn't too much happening until in 2012, the Syrian uprising. I mean, the PYD was outlawed under the Assad regime until the revolution. I mean, still, but they came back because there was chaos. And a lot of Syrians had been serving in the PKK's militia. About 20% of that was always Syrian because Öcalan had been based in Damascus. They did a lot of organizing in Syria, mostly to get people to fight in Turkey because they didn't want to get kicked out of Syria. So they didn't fight that much there. But with the Syrian uprising, it became possible for the PYD to come back. And they already had built some kind of foundation of organizers and groups in different parts of the Kurdish area of Syria. And these were able now to come out in the open and really organize properly. And the Assad government basically withdrew its army from the Kurdish area, and the Kurds moved into the vacuum. And they have been accused ever since of being collaborators with the Assad government. Their statement about this is they don't want to be part of this war. They don't want to have anything to do with the Syrian government, and they don't agree with the opposition either, because the opposition has never been very friendly to Kurds. They want to take a third way and work on their own area and their own method of self-government and hope that it will spread. And anyway, so that brings us to Kobani and the time most of us got interested. In Turkey, back in Turkey, Erdogan's conduct over Kobani, which was atrocious, led to his defeat in the 2016 election, which he had hoped to become, a great leader. And the Kurdish party, a new left party, the HDP, got over 10% of the vote, which meant he could not rule without making a coalition government, and he wouldn't do a coalition government. So instead he called a special election, in the meantime made war on the Kurdish areas and arrested all the HDP leaders who are still in jail. And this led to a PKK-backed uprising in the south that brought down even more repression from Turkey, and has led to devastation in the region. Really scorched earth, whole cities destroyed, including a very historic one that was a UNESCO monument called Sur, and almost the entire leadership structure of the HDP in jail. Its women's committees, which were very strong in many of these Turkish towns after the developments I've told you about, outlawed. They're not allowed to have any women's organizations anymore. Thousands of dead and homeless people, and a shutdown on the policy, any possibility of doing open political work for a while. And even despite all of this repression, Erdogan's referendum, which was held last month, barely passed, just a couple percentage points. But the structures that are, including the strategies that originated in Turkey for organizing women and were pioneered in Turkey, have, even if they can't be fulfilled there, they are being fulfilled in Rojava, and that's where I think we can take our lessons from. And again, I want to repeat the points I made before. Ideologically, women are at the center of this revolution, replacing the working class as the leading agent of the revolution. Öcalan says, this is a quote, "The solution for all social problems in the Middle East should have women's position as a focus. The role the working class has once played must now be taken over by the sisterhood of women." That's pretty heavy. It's actually an amazing statement for a former Marxist guerrilla. So that's ideological. Organizational, there are dual structures at every level so that women learn to give leadership and have control over their own work. And there are co-leaders of every organization and minimum quotas for women of 40%. And in program, there are certain key elements. Self-defense, women must be part of the armed struggle, which is very different, by the way, in terms of an attitude toward an armed struggle from that prevalent in the Western feminist movement. a central emphasis on combating violence against women, and a cooperative economic base, drawing women out of the home gradually into public life, because the Kurdish women in Rojava were peasants and living in an Islamic society largely confined to the home and doing agricultural work and working inside the house. And just to get them into socialized production is a very big deal. Now, all these ideas, ideological, organizational, and programmatic, are not necessarily restricted to Kurdistan. Similar things could be done elsewhere. They are in some places. They're already setting up women's consuls in some parts of Germany among Kurds. But the idea of dual structure and autonomy for women's organizations was very basic to the second wave of the feminist movement, the women's liberation movement, as Roxanne and I both came out of. And I remember Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, who was here, also talking about self-defense as a major element in any kind of strategy we had, although she emphasized karate rather than Taekwondo, right. And so we're now at we're now, because of the backlash against feminism, because of the character of this period, because of the enormous strength of the right wing, at a point where I think the left really has to take into account what it would mean to become a left that made feminism central. And it means a lot more than talking the correct language about gender, believe me. It means actually helping create space for women to give leadership. Just in conclusion, the Rojava Revolution is a work in progress. It's only a few years old. I agree with Karen that it is important to support it as a vital place where democracy is happening and being experimented with it, and for hope in the Middle East. But in terms of feminism, as well as democracy, it has not yet even addressed certain issues that people here would consider vitally important. For instance, sex. People who are in the militias, the YPG, YPJ, are celibate. People who are in the PKK are celibate. The YPG, it's not exactly quite the same. And the Syrian example is starting to differ a little from the Turkish one, although they're still very close. But the whole idea of even talking about sexual relations is very much off the table for the moment. As are ideas about free expression and individual rights. And there is still a problem, which is true in many places in the Middle East and South Asia, particularly, and in a different way in Latin America, of a culture that's honor-based and tribal, which has to some degree been transferred to the left-wing organizations, so that you're fighting for the people rather than the honor of your family, but it's still very much an honor thing, which I find problematic and basically very open to male control. And then there's also the complicated part played by the PKK, because how do you reconcile a bottom-up democratic revolution with a top-down Marxist-Leninist party, which still exists to some extent, although its form has very much changed, and it isn't running everything in the same way. So I think those ideas remain on the table, but I would suggest that our task here is, one, to support the revolution that exists and make sure that those people survive and get the kind of political as well as military support they need. And second, to see what we can do with some of their ideas here.
No, I think the theoretical foundation is very important, because this did all flow from philosophical conversion of Abdullah Öcalan whilst in prison, as Meredith said, based, and we should note that we have an extraordinary connection here in New York City with the former wife and lifelong political comrade and daughter of Murray Bookchin amongst us. Öcalan read Murray Bookchin's work. Murray Bookchin was a Lower East Side anarchist, then a Vermonter, who is an extraordinary inspiration and part of this revolution in northeast Syria. The other point I would add is Meredith's conclusion. This is a work in progress. When I was there, there would be, I went to a communal assembly in a village which was co-chaired by a man and a woman, but the men and the women in the meeting were sitting separately. And I also went to they're trying to adopt a legal system where social peace rather than punishment is the goal, where collectively what is to be done about wrongdoing is decided amongst the group rather than in a formal state-down structure. It's an extraordinarily interesting thing that they're trying to do to address crime and wrongdoing in a creative, constructive way rather than merely punitive. But the assembly I went to was solely men. So there is a real transition being made from a highly traditional male-dominated society to something else, and it's by no means there yet.
At the same time, the leader of the what they call the Wrath of the Euphrates, the effort to take Raqqa, the leader of the SDF forces is a woman, Rojava, if I got her name correctly, and is not only directing the SDF forces, many battalions of men and women, but also giving direction to the United States Special Operation Forces who are helping them on the ground. So that's an interesting aspect too. And I'd like to just add that in addition to Meredith's book, another book that I think is instructive about this is in fact my father's book, this book, The Next Revolution, Popular Assemblies and the Promise of Direct Democracy, because the 9 essays in here very much speak to this kind of organizational model that's being put into practice in Rojava now, and that Murray, who, he died a little over 10 years ago, and never got to see what was going on in Rojava, although he was actually contacted by Öcalan's representatives who wanted to be in dialogue with him, because Öcalan basically wrote to him and said, I consider myself your student. And these ideas are the ideas that we've been sort of looking for, because precisely as Meredith and Karn said, this idea of seizing state power had really become discredited, not least by the fall of the Soviet Union and by all the various sort of failed experiments at seizing state power. And I think that what Öcalan found appealing about Murray's writing, and that I think is pertinent also for the left here in the United States and elsewhere in Europe today, is the idea of trying to find a sort of a third way, not seizing state power on the one hand, and not, as many of you who may be familiar with some of Murray's work, he was an anarchist for many decades, not on the other hand what has become very traditional in certain aspects of anarchist theory, the idea of working outside of the state, building alternative institutions, but rather what Murray describes is a sort of a philosophy that would allow you to go on the municipal level into politics, and not in a way where you're just simply running candidates and hoping that those candidates will then be responsive to the base, but doing what municipalist movements are starting to do now in various parts of the world. We see it in Chiapas, Mexico. We see it now in Barcelona. Barcelona and Camus has started a citizens platform where people are actually going into government on the municipal level, but very much as delegates of popular assemblies in every small neighborhood, rather than as political representatives, sort of the way we think of somebody like Bernie Sanders, for example, who has his whatever you want to call it a great line or a good line or a reformist line, but something certainly a lot better than Hillary Clinton, and you vote and then you hope that, that's going to be the best choice. The idea here is a different kind of politics where delegates are transparent, where they are recallable, where there is a platform that they adhere to. And that is basically what they are trying to do in Rojava right now. I mean, it's very much the concept of self-rule is really about reinventing politics, about creating a politics that's citizen-driven. And both Öcalan, I think, and Murray saw the idea of the citizen becoming, in a certain sense, the empowered force for political change. And we think about this a little bit in terms of what we call prefigurative politics, what we were doing at Occupy, for example, where people make the politics it's not simply the content of what we want in terms of political change, but also the form, the fact that we are responsive, that we make sure that people who traditionally haven't had voices are able to speak, that we incorporate ideas and that we try and use consensus where possible. So those kinds of ideas, I think Murray saw that as a sort of a third pole, a way in between that wasn't statist, that wasn't sort of outside existing institutions, and that acknowledged the idea that there will always be power. It's not a question of somehow dissipating power, which has often been a kind of more traditional anarchist concept, but the question is, in whose hands does the power reside? And the question, again, of sort of, instead of just, what I'm excited about these ideas, and what really excites me about what's going on in places like Barcelona and in Rojava, is the idea that the sense that power is now being, diffused and brought down to the local level. And one of the very important aspects of this, I think, that Bookchin and Öcalan also shared, was the importance of education. And in Rojava and even in Turkey, but especially now in Rojava, they've set up, one of the first things they did was set up these, what they call Mesopotamian academies. And so everybody, even the people who are just planning to go off to war, cycle through and spend several weeks studying, reading, understanding history, and trying to incorporate the ideology of this new form of re-empowerment, so that, and for us in the left, I mean, the question is, how do we sort of go from, we keep sort of protesting the power of the nation state, how do we get to the point where we can actually usurp that power? And the idea is that by building on the local level, we begin to do that, and we begin to, in a sense, build countervailing institutions that contest the power of the nation state.